everyone. Welcome back for another debate. The motion before the House. This House believes only socialism can save us. We're very fortunate to have an incredible lineup of speakers with us tonight, who I can't wait to hear from. But just before we do, I'll quickly recap how the debate will work and how you can get involved. We'll begin with a round of paper speakers in proposition and opposition. These speeches are to be 10 minutes. As our speakers approach the end of their time, David here will flash a friendly reminder in their face when they have 1 minute left. I ask that they don't take any points of information after this so that they can progress to the end of their speech. There are two ways members can get involved during debates. The first is through interrupting the speaker at any point during their speech by saying, on that point or point of information. It is then up to the speaker whether they take your point. The second way to get involved is through floor speeches. After the first round and the second round of paper speakers, I'll open to the floor for speeches in proposition, opposition, and abstention. These speeches should be 1 to 2 minutes, and please state your name and college before you start. So just so everyone's clear, we'll have a round of paper speakers, floor speeches, another round of paper speakers, another round of floor speeches, and then we'll have our closing paper speakers. Without further ado, let's begin the debate with our opening proposition speaker, Sir David King. Sir David is the Emeritus Professor of Chemistry at the University of Cambridge, founder and chair of the Centre for Climate Repair in the university, and chair of the Climate Crisis Advisory Group. He served as the UK government's chief scientific advisor and the Foreign Secretary, special representative on climate change. David, you have the ears of the House.
Madam President, friends, colleagues, as you've heard, I'm a Cambridge University academic, and I've worked here for many, many years of my life. And I left the university and down in college, where I was master, in the year 2000, went into government where I served with Tony Blair and then Gordon Brown as chief scientific advisor. But I stayed on in government and also, perhaps unusually, then served the coalition government of David Cameron, his subsequent government, and also the government of Theresa May, when I was working then in the Foreign Office as the climate envoy for the United Kingdom. And now what I want to say, my comments are largely based on this experience in science diplomacy, working very heavily all through that period on the biggest challenge humanity has ever had to face up to, which is climate change. And week by week, month by month, that challenge is getting more and more serious. So I think I have to start by saying a manageable future for humanity is now very much in question. I'm just going to give one example. The latest analysis shows that the third biggest rice producer in the world, Vietnam, the whole country, 90% of the country, will be under seawater once a year by mid-century, right? Less than 30 years from now. And following that, we've got Jakarta and Indonesia. Jakarta will no longer be the capital. It's being moved to higher land. We've got massive flooding. And I'm just talking about Southeast Asia and southeastern China. Biggest rice-producing area in the world. And we will have massive rice failures in terms of the need of the world. We import an awful lot of food from other parts of the world. And by this I mean to say, actually none of us will be insulated from the challenges of climate change, although it's going to impact most severely on the poor. Many of you will have seen that in India today, temperatures are 40 to 50 degrees centigrade, and this is the highest April, I'm talking about the end of last month, highest April temperatures ever observed in that part of the world, higher by a very big margin. And you will all know that in the United States and in Canada last year, the western coast experienced temperatures again, 50 degrees centigrade. Human beings cannot survive at high humidity and these temperatures without air conditioning. And the threat, therefore, is to millions of lives in that part of the world. That's where we are today. So when I say a manageable future for humanity is now in question, I'm actually seriously concerned about this, which is why I've set up a Centre for Climate Repair here in Cambridge. We need to repair the climate. It's in a very bad state. If we look at the needs that we face, we need science, we need technology, we need targets, we need accountability. But first, we need an understanding at a cultural level of the relationship between people and planet. I just want to make this statement. We are not apart from nature. We have treated ourselves as if we were above nature, that we could always get away with that wrecking nature around us. We are a part of nature. Big difference between those two words, apart and apart. Now, the past decade, and I have to admit this, have yielded several major commitments towards sustainability. The Paris Agreement first and foremost. And at Glasgow last year, we saw net zero emission commitments, following Theresa May's commitment made just a few weeks before she came to the end of her premiership towards net zero emissions. So I would say once again, it was Britain in the lead saying to the world, let's get to net zero. You may say I'm going to contradict the argument that is before you, and I am going to propose the motion to you. So what we see is that these commitments have not been followed through. The share of renewables in the global energy system today has barely increased since 2015. The biggest change occurred between 2005 and 2015, and then it's halted. Right? So land degradation persists. Fresh water is under stress. Extreme weather events, and I've already referred to this, are more extreme than ever before. Those temperatures up in British Columbia, up in Canada, 5 or 10 degrees centigrade above the highest temperature previously observed. Now, those of you who've got time afterwards, I'm happy to explain why this all happened. But let me just say, it's because of what's happening in the Arctic Circle region. The ice covering the Arctic Ocean has now receded to the point where 50% of the Arctic Ocean is exposed during the summer, the polar summer in the North Pole region, is exposed to sunlight. The sea is exposed to sunlight. The ice has always been reflecting sunlight back into space. The sea absorbs 80% of that sunlight. The North Pole during those 3 months is one of the warmest regions of the Northern Hemisphere. So what we have is a North Pole where 30 degrees centigrade has been observed. The air above is getting warm. Greenland ice is melting more and more rapidly with time. When all of that has melted, sea levels will have risen by 6.5 meters, 23 feet. That's just looking at the ice on Greenland, not counting in Antarctica, not counting in the Himalayas, etc. Why is there this continued gap between international deals and our deteriorating ecosystems?
On that point,
Who's talking? Whoa, somebody behind the light.
Projections show that even if we meet the Paris Agreement targets, we're still going to have a rise of over 3 degrees centigrade, so that's not enough. So
I couldn't agree more. So if I could say, I agree with you completely.
What we actually need to do is like COVID-19 level lockdown stuff to get rid of climate change. Do you think we should go that far, or is there a point before that we can stop?
So you're taking over my major point. But thank you for doing that, because I think what I'm now saying is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has now issued its most severe warnings in its 6th report published over the last year in three stages. The world is now on track for 3 degrees centigrade by the end of the century. It's now on track for 1 to 2 meters sea level rise by the end of the century. We'd be underwater right here at 1 meter sea level rise. That's by the end of the century. But even before then, as I've indicated, there are parts of the world which will be underwater very severely. So what we understand now is we're at 1.35 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial level. The objective is 1.5, agreed in Paris. and I was the negotiator pushing for the 1.5. It's not enough. We're at 1.35, and already we have all of these disasters occurring following what's happening in the Arctic Circle region. And the real danger is that the overturning current, the AMOC, if you're the expert, you might know what the AMOC is also possibly going to switch off. These are like dominoes. One goes and the next one is put under threat. And that, frankly, is end game. What we're looking at is potential temperature rises over the next 200 years, or even less, 150 years, 10 degrees centigrade. Sea level rises way above anything we could imagine living through. So there's the nature of the challenge. And I really am not happy to be saying this, because this challenge requires a real change in our view as to how important it is, and therefore how we can all pull together to manage this. Why are we failing? I've got 1 minute remaining. I'm failing too. So what we know is that since 1992, when COP meetings met, they've failed. Now let me tell you one of the reasons for the failure is the United States. Has the United States taken the usual leadership position, which they have taken since 1947, setting up the United Nations, which they set in 1987 with the Montreal Protocol? Absolutely not. When I was working with Blair, he kept sending me in to see George Bush, and I just got a flea in the ear. And I tried to help negotiate in the G8 meeting held in Scotland when we were in the presidency, and the Prime Minister Blair said we're only going to have climate change on the agenda. What happens in that situation is that the Sherpas from each country, acting for their head of state, try to get an agreement. The United States says, send us the agreement from the other 7 countries. And when it got to them, they literally redlined every single thing that meant any action. What's behind that? I've got to very quickly say, what lies behind that is this massive lobby system in the United States, which has many senators and congressmen in their pockets. What also lies behind that is the extraordinarily wealthy people which have emerged from the business of being able to keep your wealth away from taxes by putting them into tax havens. So what we have in this country and in the United States is a very small number of very wealthy people controlling a big section of the media. That is the reason. I'm now reading my concluding statement. And what I'm going to say is addressing the motion that the only way we're going to manage this is by revisiting the whole idea of the market principle. The market principle is amazingly successful. We can all say it has delivered well-being for humanity right around the world. But I'm going to say to you, the unfettered market system that emerged from the period of Thatcher and Reagan is now responsible for the situation we're in today. Who's going to deal with that unfettered market system? I think it's going to be people on the left and not people on the right. And I'm saying this from my experience. I wish I had another minute. in which I could just refer to the fact that I was one of those who wrote a speech for the Prime Minister in 2015 leading up to that meeting in Paris, the United Nations meeting. And David Cameron read the speech word for word and got the biggest oration of any head of government at that meeting. He ended up with our statement fed in there, which was, and we will be the greenest country in the world. And then he took it all away by saying, without any green actions, which he meant without any regulations or obligations. We cannot manage this unless governments are prepared to grasp it and go for regulatory and obligatory systems to switch us out of fossil fuels and to move into a future in which the world pulls together. And by that I mean all countries pulling together, sharing the burden of managing this, particularly the developed world, working with the underdeveloped world, with the developing world, the least developed countries, to help them make the transition. We all need to take responsibility. This is a very different world, and my one word for that is we need to create an eco-civilization in which we manage human well-being alongside the well-being of our ecosystems with equal importance. And I only think that's going to come from the left of center. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir David. Moving on to the opposition, Claire Barnett. Claire is Executive Director of UN Women UK, fighting to make gender equality a reality at every level of society. She has campaigned for the representation of women in the global climate discourse and the importance of accelerating gender equality in addressing climate change. Claire, the floor is yours.
Right. As long as I don't get a high heel stuck between the wooden floorboards, we're going to be fine. Thank you to the committee, but to all of you for having me here today, and also for the efforts that you've gone to over years now to make the union a more inclusive place. This is the first time I've ever been in a union chamber, and I tended to avoid spaces like this when I was at university because nobody in my family had ever spoken in a space like this, and so I assumed they weren't for me. But I feel very honoured to be here today because, like many of our institutions, it's still not perfect in that regard, but if it creates a space for people with different views to come together and find common solutions for difficult problems, that's a very special thing. Today's motion reflects a news cycle of accelerating disaster, as we've just heard, not only climate, but also COVID, crisis, and conflict. And these issues compound each other to destroy not only human life, but also ecological life. Before the Taliban took over Kabul, the country already had some of the highest rates of gender-based violence in the world. Haiti has dealt with an onslaught of climate destruction as well as political struggles, and India has experienced a huge number of excess COVID deaths at the same time as its population struggles with water scarcity and extreme weather. As the proposition has told you and will continue to tell you, time is running out. By the way, all of these issues are also heavily gendered. One of the most widespread weapons of conflict is sexual assault. And when we see issues like the COVID pandemic and other crises affect communities, unfortunately, sexual exploitation and domestic abuse rise. When there's a lack of food and clean water, women are responsible for traveling longer and longer distances to provide, largely they are the providers of food and water for their households and are also the last to get access to clean food and water. Women and children are still 14 times more likely to die in a climate-related disaster, and women are 80% more or less of those displaced by climate. But to be clear on the question, what we're not discussing today is whether climate change is a disaster. We're not discussing whether socialism is a preferable economic system to others or whether it has to be part of our vision for the future. And we're not discussing whether capitalism is the thing that got us here. What we're discussing today is whether only the economic system of socialism specifically can save us. And I think there are three parts to this question. There's socialism as an economic system, its ability to save us, and then crucially, whether it alone can do that. So we're probably all agreed from the issues that we've talked about that we do need something to save us, or rather to save ourselves. Whether we can agree on whether socialism itself is that thing and is the determiner of success in countries with that economic system currently in place is probably up for debate. There is enormous variation in the attitude towards climate action and other socio-ecological issues within nations that call themselves socialist. While we may disagree with claims that socialism is what has ruined economies in Cuba and Venezuela for years, it certainly hasn't saved their populations. And the Nordic model is often brought up as an example of this, but a lot of Nordic states, populations and leaders have themselves said publicly, we don't identify with being socialist. So there must be something else at play. When we look at some of the most gender-equal nations in the world, you have examples like Iceland and Rwanda with very different economic systems, but there must be something there in terms of what surrounds that, the political values and the morals that people hold dear. So I think it's about implementation rather than doctrine. I was speaking to the amazing Sir David over dinner earlier, which is definitely one of the highlights of my time tonight. And we were talking about examples of more right-wing governments where they have taken a hardline stance pro-climate action. And we were talking about the well-known example of Margaret Thatcher's government, where she was very into talking about the harm that CFCs can cause and the need to address those to the environment. And we said, why is that? And Sir David, I think, with his expertise, was talking about, well, Margaret Thatcher was a known scientist. She was very interested in being able to hold that up as a value. And I know, as somebody who works in gender equality, and all of the women and other minoritized people in this room also know, that you have to code switch a lot when you're in environments where you're the minority. And Margaret Thatcher was the minority. And I think being able to show that scientific knowledge, really, what that shows for me is that we were able to access a specific value that she held dear to herself and use that as a way in to important action on climate and engagement with that. And I think there's a lesson to be learned there. Now, I might have imagined this, but I have a small thing in the back of my mind that I think when I said that, Sir David might have said, oh, I need to change my speech. So that brings me to whether socialism is the only thing that can save us. Well, I talked a lot about how these crises are heavily gendered. I also want to talk a bit about the fact that the good news is that empowering women is an amazing lever that we can pull other than the economic system of socialism. And sure, it often goes alongside it, but it is a separate lever that we can pull to save both an enormous number of human lives and climate. When we put resources in the hands of women, they typically reinvest 90% back into their families and communities. Giving women equal access to natural resources can increase production on women's farms in developing countries by 20 to 30%. And if we were able to achieve that, that would raise total agricultural production in developing countries by between 2.5 and 4%. Essentially, that is reducing the number of hungry people in the world by 100 to 150 million people. And the impact that gender equality can have on our future is not limited to the land. We know that we have longer-lasting peace and better states of peace when women are included as peace builders. We know that if we were able to give all of the women who want access to contraceptives in the world that access and improve girls' education, we would have a huge impact on problematic population growth. And that's just giving access to the people who say, I want to have access to this. So how do we go about achieving some of these changes? Yes, please go ahead. So I think it's, go ahead. I think it's a really important question, and I think what we need to be clear on is that, Alain de Botton says of religions, there's so much good that we need to take from them. And so often, even if you're not a religious person, you might take bits from those religions that you think are valuable to society, whatever your view is. And I think the point of this debate is not to start saying, every good that socialism has been aligned with is now part of socialism. I think we need to look at what socialism is at its core as an economic system. And I will get shortly to why I think that's important, not just as a theoretical academic debate in this room, but because it affects the kind of work that we all go out into the world and do. So the way that UN Women is achieving change is, and in the past year, by the way, we've achieved 262 legal reforms to advance gender equality in 69 countries, provided life-changing access to resilient technologies and tools like more climate-resilient seeds to 101,000 rural women, and we have delivered gendered disaster risk reduction, I always struggle to say that, work that will affect the lives of 107 million people. And the way that we've done that, and I know that this is a bad word these days, but is through diplomacy. And all that means is through that's understanding what values matter to all governments around the world and approaching them and saying, I need you to make change for this, and I'm going to access that using an argument that makes sense to you. If we refuse to speak to non-socialists about these issues because we don't think that they agree with us and we don't see ourselves in them, we are not only leaving behind the people who are asking for our help, but we're also overlooking our common ground as fellow citizens of this earth. When the USA left the Paris Agreement, we didn't abandon the process. If we reject people who don't share our belief system, I think we are in danger of further alienating those who don't share our view. When Audre Lorde said the master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house, what she was talking about in that speech was the importance of having diverse representation within the feminist movement, because she believed that only by embracing that diversity could we work together to come up with better, more creative ideas. It wasn't about getting everybody behind the same system, whatever that system is, even a new one. It was saying actually the best ideas come from when we get people in a room with differing philosophies and economic systems and have that conversation together. So, thank you, I have 1 minute. So what I'm going to say is, finally, is the seeds of injustice that created and are now exacerbating climate change and a lot of these other crises impacting already the lives of the most marginalized historically more now, were sown by people. And it has to be people who do the work to undo oppression and injustice finding this common ground. There is no silver bullet. And with 12 million hectares of land and almost lost and almost 5 million girls at risk of FGM every year and rising, I don't think we have the time to wait for the world to transition to a new economic system. And so that's why I don't think socialism is the only thing that can save us. Firstly, it's not clear that it's working alone in practice at the moment without the influence of other political things. Secondly, there are other fights like that of gender equality that I hope I've shown a little bit about how much of an impact that can have on saving literally millions of lives. And finally, I really don't think we have the time. This is about honest conversations, diverse perspectives, pulling up more folding chairs to the negotiating table. And sitting around waiting for a new economic system to come along is so easy for us to do when actually what we need to be doing is getting out into the world, trying to convince people who don't agree with us that they have to take meaningful action now. So finally, why I think that your opinion on this is so important. It will be interesting about who wins the vote on this debate, but I think really it's about the people in this room represent so much talent and potential. And I think if we sit and say we're not going to take part in trying to convince people who don't agree with us because we all want the world to be about reaching a common economic system which has never been achieved before, I really think we're missing an opportunity. So I hope that it's not cliche to say that you, the people in this room, especially if you're a student, are our future. And I hope that you'll never tire of seeking ways to go out into the community, talk to people who don't agree with you, and make changes that will ultimately save us and generations to come. So the choice is yours.
Thank you very much, Claire. Thank you. Thank you. Order, please. Order. Order. Thank you. We'll now do a round of floor speeches. Would anyone like to speak in proposition?
Hello? Oh, okay. Thank you. Well, first of all, I'll start by thanking the opposition because as a Venezuelan, I can say there is a fair point to say that socialism hasn't worked in Venezuela. And that's very easy to point out, but no one brings up the cases of Pinochet in Chile, and as a Latin American I can say it, Stroessner, the military juntas in Brazil, that all of them has one thing in common, which is a capitalist system, maximizing profits and not really caring about fundamental social issues. And here is where my question comes into place. When the opposition is bringing all these points, Kabul, feminism, climate change, COVID, do we care about the green numbers related to those issues, how much they are making for our economy, or do we want to target them? Do we care about human lives, or do we care about these numbers? And it's something interesting because capitalist governments are known for several things, good and bad. But one peculiar thing, and Thatcher has been mentioned to date, and Reagan, is the small size of government. And what we need during these times of crisis, during these times of social problems, is not to leave things to someone else. And talking about feminism, I'll bring up my mother to the conversation. When I was a child, she used to always tell me, if you want to do something right, don't leave it to someone else. Do it by yourself. And that's what our governments should do. That's what our socialist governments should care about our human rights, about our lives, and not only about our green numbers in the economy. Thank you.
anyone like to speak in opposition of the motion? Name and college, please.
Varinchi Ralabandi, Clare Hall. So I guess I have a couple of issues with the motion. First of all, it's somewhat difficult to define exactly what makes a particular policy socialist or not. For example, in America, universal healthcare is often derided as socialist healthcare, whereas in the rest of the civilized world, universal healthcare is just called healthcare. And that essentially brings me to the main point, which is that it's not really about what ideology you choose. It's trying to find the right solution for many problems. And in many of those cases, it's not your ideology is not actually relevant at all. For example, the proposition raised the case of lobbyists and money interests in politics. That, I don't think, in my opinion, is going to suddenly change based on whether you're a capitalist or a socialist. All sides of politics have their lobbyists, have their financing from various sources. So tackling those kind of issues is not going to be about switching to socialism. And even if we switch to socialism, we're not going to be rid of those problems. And if those problems are what's creating the issue, then socialism is not going to save us from them. And similarly, sometimes it's going to take a whole suite of policies, some of which will be classed as more socialist, for example, be it just transition schemes to close down coal mines and so on, but to support the workers who've been basically kicked out of their job. But in other cases, the market can be used for good too, for example, through emissions trading schemes or carbon pricing mechanisms. And so it's going to take a whole suite of policies, some of which will be classed as more socialist, some of which will leverage existing market systems, and some of which are just going to be completely ideology independent. Thank you.
Thank you. And would anyone like to speak in abstention of the motion?
Hi. There's maybe an ambiguity in this motion that I might like to clear up. The phrase "only socialism can save us" might imply that socialism would be enough. But if it's not, but still necessary, then it's not really saying very much to say we should adopt more socialist policies. So I'm just going to do something which I think needs to be done for this debate, which is define socialism in a very simple way, which is economic democracy. A socialist policy is something like a worker co-op, where instead of an executive branch in a company, you have bottom-up indication for major policies and shared equity, shared means of production of said company. No, we need some working definition, and I understand it's a complex topic, but so let's take as an assumption, which is a generous way, that people care about climate change in general, and a more democratically owned company system will be more environmentally conscious. Even at that best case, where all of Britain is made of, say, worker co-ops of environmentally conscious people, that doesn't necessarily stop Bolsonaro tearing down good chunks of the Amazon, and also doesn't necessarily stop Russia exporting huge amounts of oil and burning more oil in all the sense as well. So my point is, adopting socialism nationally is not enough to solve a global problem. What you need, really, is global coordination of something like this. And even if it's the case that socialism in this sort of collective mindedness and global planetary identity does lead to more climate change oriented policy, it won't save us if this is necessary. So this phrase of only socialism can save us might not be worthwhile if what's really doing the work is international coordination. That's all.
Thank you. We'll now move back to our proposition paper speakers with His Excellency Rafael Ortiz Fabrega. His Excellency has served as the ambassador of Costa Rica to the UK since 2018. With more than 99% of its energy generated from renewable resources, Costa Rica has led the world in ambitious policies to combat climate change. Rafael, you have the ears of the House.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you for inviting us tonight here. It's really an honor and a pleasure. Well, some of the comments that have been made after the distinguished speakers lead me to start and maybe deviate a bit from what my comments were. And in relation to the word of socialism, I would really have to start a bit to explain what has been the experience of Costa Rica. Because if I were to take this concept in a very strict definition, my friend here from Latin America, hermano venezolano, I would have to say that Venezuela, if that is what socialism is, we should really, put that away and never see something like that again. But my country very proudly decided 74 years ago, first of all, to abolish the army. And then we were able, with those resources, to start investing in education, to start having a universal health care that is very similar, obviously with not the abundant resources that we might have here in the UK. But we built a society that if we would have to frame it in terms of some sort of ideology, we could say it was social democratic, social Christian. Those were the two main parties that governed basically Costa Rica in the second part of the 20th century. We had, free education. When I was talking to Sid here, and what a very good university here, the cost of it is amazing. But in Costa Rica, if a child is born without resources and he has the ability and the will to continue to study, he can go all the way to get a PhD without actually not only having to pay, but having the ability to receive resources. I don't consider that necessarily the strict definition of socialism. I appeal more to the principles of humanism and solidarity, of giving people an opportunity. And this, in a way, I think constructed in our society a state, yes, interventionist to a certain point, which I believe is necessary when you are facing important problems that cannot be just left to the market. The market, like you say, is important. There are possibilities to really coordinate important decisions in cap and trade and dealing with the externalities that economic theory gives you to the ability to conduct. But in our country, I think that concept of solidarity that gave us the opportunity to construct a society where our life expectancy is probably above many other of the countries of the OECD. We are only the fourth country of Latin America that has become a member. We've invested a lot in that. Now, one would say, what does this relate to climate change? Through the years, and going back 50 years, our governments, independent of their for the ideology, if you might call it that, or social democrat, social Christian, maybe a little bit more free market. But we decided, I guess, since we were blessed with probably having one of the most beautiful countries in the world, which I invite you to visit, in 52,000 kilometers, we have 6% of the world biodiversity. So we were, very keen to say, this is something that we have to keep for our future generations. We had in the 70s, we were going on the wrong track. We probably had only 22% of forest coverage. But we enacted policies that nowadays almost has made Costa Rica to have 60% of forest coverage. How did we do that? In a way, it was what we could consider a sort of intervention of the economy in terms of putting a tax on petrol and using those funds to give farmers, people that lived in the fields, the money for them not to destroy the forest, but actually to reforestation and to really construct a better environment. And that has also led to a a byproduct of having Costa Rica as one of the leading countries in ecotourism, because now they can, obviously you just can't tell somebody don't work in the fields, don't make a living, because that's not the way it works. You have to give them the possibility of having an alternative. And we did that through intervention in petrol taxes, paying them for financial, environmental services. So every hectare that they reforest, the government will fund it. And this has created small enterprises in terms of what we have done in ecotourism. And I could tell you very proudly that pretty much 99% of our energy is renewable, because it's a country that we have a rain, we have wind, we have solar. So that has created not only a benefit that we're doing the right thing for the planet, but nowadays that a lot of the big companies want to establish themselves in other countries, they're going to Costa Rica because they can all say we're manufacturing with renewables. So I don't know if we could say that, and we created specific laws that attract investment and that they take advantage of this for the well-being of the planet. But in terms of our leadership in the world, and we saw that very clearly here in COP, we signed an agreement, and we started it with Denmark. It's called BOGA. It's Beyond Gas, and that initiative that is creating more countries and being aligned to work our way out of fossil fuels. We have created programs that we have called the next abolition. I say very proudly, we abolished the army in 1949. For this generation, the next abolition is the decarbonization of the economy. We were one of the first countries to set forth the goal that by 2050, we would be net zero. So this is a way that we have promoted also in young people's startups, initiatives that go forward in creating that. Right now, in terms of electrical vehicles, in Costa Rica now we have charging stations. Obviously, it's a small country, but if you have an electrical vehicle, right now we're up to about 5% of our vehicles are already electric or some sort of hybrid. But we are now in the possibility of traveling around our country with electrical vehicles. So when I think of how we do also nature-based solutions, we're very proud also to have established the Eastern Tropical Marine Corridor. As you're aware, everybody probably has heard about the Galapagos in Ecuador. Well, we have the Coco Island also. So we have created a corridor that goes from Ecuador to Colombia, Costa Rica, and Panama. And like I said, our country is very small, but if we look at the territory, our ocean territory makes up about 97% of the whole territory of Costa Rica. By declaring this corridor in the island of Cocos Island, that is very in that area, we are now able to protect 30% of that area of the oceans. We have been leaders in the High Ambition Coalition with France and with the UK, which has the objective that by 2030, we will protect 30% of the oceans and of our land. 1 minute remaining. So, in conclusion, what I can say is obviously we need governments that have decision. And this has been something that has not been delayed because of a change of one party to another. I think it's something that has to be created, and when I see you here in the future, that we transmit that we are very clear that those have to be policies that go beyond the change of a government. And it has to be strong, because I agree with Sir David. Sometimes we will find, and I was a congressman before, people will try to maybe delay certain of these decisions. And there, I don't even think it's socialism. I think it's a matter of principles when you have to decide if you're going to be on the right side of history or you're not. And so, in conclusion, I believe that yes, I only have like 10 seconds, but if you can do it real fast.
How might you ensure this
I'm sorry.
How might you ensure that the policy is kept between transition of elected governments? Would that require authoritarianism?
I think it's a matter of the conviction of a nation that is basically very much aligned with these principles. And it comes to a point that is very hard to a given party, even if it's in power, to try to, come back on these regulations and are these decisions. So it has become like a policy of state that we have, that we have conducted it in many organizations in COP26, where we are pretty much aligned with a lot of the proposals that initiatives that Sir David maybe took many years ago. So that has been I think a situation that has put Costa Rica on the map, that has created the possibility of attracting investments, that has given us the possibility of leading by example, even though we are a small country. So we need, when I think of my two granddaughters, my youngest one will be 2 years old in a matter of weeks. And when I think and I see what Sir David was saying, when she's going to be my age, in her 60s, what is the world going to be for her? What is the world going to be for when you young people have children? We cannot delay this. And I believe that requires that we hold these positions and that we make our governments strong, that we have the initiatives to coordinate, obviously with good economic policy, but we can't fail. Because if we fail, we will no longer exist. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. We now move on to our second opposition speaker. Order, please. Order. Order, please. Thank you. Our second opposition speaker, Philip Altai. Philip is a first-year History and Politics undergraduate at Peterhouse. Philip, the floor is yours.
Madam President, thank you. And so many things have already been said. Let me just try and flesh out the argument in different terms a bit. And I hope you will follow me through. Because by agreeing to speak on this motion tonight, I think both opposition and proposition agree that we are in desperate need for salvation, and with regard to climate change in particular. Now, at hardly any point in time, I think, have we found ourselves looking out into a wide and open field the way we do now. The conquerors of the Americas looked over the same great plain before they rooted out everything that had been there before. The fathers of industry looked over the same plain before they torched it. And so did all the other missionaries of our modern capitalist system that we had sent out across the globe to preach the gospel of everlasting growth. And if we now look closely enough at that plain before us, we can see the effects. The earth is still burning, the sky is still filled with smoke, the sun is glowing red, and dust fills up the air. The same forces that had destructed our natural environment had equally worn down the people working on it. And to the sight of these wretched of the earth, some of us crafted a distinct response, that is socialism. It seeks to lift up those whose lungs are filled with toxic dust. It seeks to make them breathe again. It seeks to return to them, as we've already heard, the fields they are working on and supply them with the strength to actually reap what they produce and restore life to an otherwise hollow existence of productive action. Now, what more would you hope for? What more could potentially be done? There's no doubt, we've already heard that from His Excellency in particular, that the many forms of socialism have crafted enormously impactful policies to mitigate the negative effects free markets have on its human capital, that is, on all of us. And when thinking about climate change, that is indeed what we have to bear in mind. The social cost of any kind of energy transition and the disproportionate effect global warming has on poorer and less developed communities. This is indeed socialist home ground, and its predisposition to care for burdened members of society is the correct response to that. And yet, socialism never touched the earth. Socialism never penetrated the ground. It never filtered out the harmful particles imbuing the air we breathe. It never made the sun shine untaintedly again. Socialism also lives off capitalism, It is one of its intellectual descendants, and as such assumes the issue of climate change, I think, in the wrong place. Yes, our current capitalist system is what is driving the rise of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, and it does so at an alarming rate. Everyone agrees on this. And yet, when we rely on socialism, we rely on the intellectual antagonist to free market capitalism, not the solution to global warming. We rely only on changing who controls production rather than transforming the way we produce. So when we lift up the broken bodies from the field of capitalism, we also need to make sure that their feet walk on lush fields. Socialism can do the former. This is what it had been designed to do. But socialism cannot do the latter. Those that speak through it are the productive beings shaping the world in their image. It has never been conceived to give the earth a voice. Now, for any kind of socialism to work, we need a strong arm to lift us out of the dust. The implementation of any of its policies requires not merely the willingness, but also the ability to intervene in public processes. Yet climate change is not about a faceless crowd of polluters. It affects not just us as a collective, but each and one of us as human individuals. It pertains to the tightest communities we live in, our most private biological needs, our deepest emotions of fear and hope, and our most intimate of life choices. And when the strong socialist arm reaches out to lift those fragile timbers of humanity out of rubble and ashes, it will not feel like a caressing human hand. Rather, we will shiver as if we were touched by a cold mechanical arm, the pressure of which we might not be able to withstand. Now, what is more, though, we must think of the plane before us as being curved, as being one of continents and oceans. Since the whole world, we've already heard that from the floor, requires salvation, the socialist arm would have to be ever stronger. It would have to extend across the sky and reach out over the lands. Yet, the international sphere is not one of socialist authority. The European project, for example, the one that has come closest to erecting any kind of political authority that might have been used to implement supranational socialism, has been rejected by this very nation not so long ago. And a global monopoly of force has not become any more likely ever since. The collective action problem climate change poses on the global level and its impact on the relations between states cannot be solved by socialism. Its core idea of a strong public force is immediately defeated by the realities of global politics. Moreover, though, our vision of the curved terrestrial plane is not shared by everyone inhabiting it. For many, it remains or has only recently become a capitalist view. The countries that have been shaped in our own image yearn for the chance to catch up. They are stretching and reaching to become part of the play that we have put on in front of them for the past centuries. They are stretching and reaching to become actors instead of the boards that we perform it on. A socialist reality is what many of them had emerged out of, because the promises on the other side had seemed so bright and their own system had collapsed. So drawing new ideological curtains is unlikely to generate any kind of political or popular support. Yet, this does not mean handing out free passes to capitalist development based on fossil fuels. Rather, we know that sustainable development is possible and that it also solves many of the social issues highlighted by global warming. Sustainable development goals have been adopted by the United Nations. They do provide a viable global alternative to a socialist regime. They allow us also to keep a promise of a better future we gave to all those who had previously been denied any kind of future. Let us remember another thing. Our plane is not a two-dimensional entity floating around somewhere outside of space and time. It is rather very multidimensional. It extends alongside many axes into all kinds of directions, and it is deeply rooted and closely interlinked with more than one world. Voting in favor of only socialism means, however, rallying behind a distinct set of assumptions about the world, even though the issue we are facing is highly complex. So should we succumb to the uniformity of a single viewpoint, we will inevitably only see a part of reality. Now, the reawakened peoples might dance under the sun, but we will never hear the screaming of the earth underneath them. Ultimately, to overcome the simplicity of our thoughts and our entrenched intellectual predispositions is crucial. Sometimes complex issues startle us, but after the initial blinding flash, we can break the light and see it in all of its constituent colors. The fundamental assumptions shared by all forms of socialism might be a solution, but only socialism could never be. And here is another uncomfortable truth. our view of the plane might be fundamentally wrong. It might be fundamentally incomplete. Thinking about the epistemic dimension of climate change inevitably tells us that we cannot know the full truth. We all agree that it's a major issue. We all agree that temperatures are rising. Everything Sir David has said is unfortunately true. And yet, even if we are able to dissect its causes and project developments into the future, everything we say needs to be qualified. Bayesianism is the order of the day. And in that sense, socialism might indeed be necessary, but it might also be far too less. We might have to go beyond anything we had previously imagined possible. And it might be that socialism is overblown. Maybe we are interpreting the signs wrong. Maybe the projections are failing us. Ultimately, charting out a path across our plane will always come with a warning. There is a risk of failure, a risk of not reaching our goals. Even if we try hard enough, we might not make it. And there's also the danger of going too far and never returning. I would like to echo the words of Sir David by saying that we have never mastered nature, never dominated Earth. And keep that in mind when you walk out those doors tonight. Madam President, the playing field we have been looking at has now narrowed. High walls are closing in, and it is rapidly being transformed into a tunnel in which we can hardly make out the sky. And this tunnel itself is already narrowing again, the walls closing in faster and faster, and behind us, the flood. Yet at the end of our vision, there still lies a gentle hill, one the waters won't reach, and it is to that hill we are all racing towards. Now, the steps we need to take to get there lead to the left and to the right. At times, we will have to reach out ourselves and pull our comrades out of peril, and at times an invisible hand seems to gently push us forward into directions we had not imagined ourselves. And the more the waters wash around our ankles, the closer it gets to our chests, the more we get caught up in the currents, the more we will have to rely on both. The challenge of climate change, we've already heard that, implicitly, is not one of either socialist cooperatives or the individualist free markets. It is not one of freedom or intervention. It is not one of fiction or reality. It is simply a struggle to escape the waters behind us. When we listen, we can hear them rushing. And when we turn around and glance into the distance, we can see the waves. That is the moment all distinctions blur. The sight of the waters reaching out for us will trigger only our survival instinct, and it will release forces within us we did not know existed. It will finally allow us to see the earth untainted by ideology, and that instinct is what we need to rely on. That is what we need to harness, what we need to transform and channel into practice, because that is what will save us. Our human ability to survive, to adapt, and to accommodate new realities. Whatever actions we will take will not be born out of conviction, but out of our ingenuity to survive. And when we finally transcend the paralysis of fear, when we finally embrace the dynamics of a new hope, we must not limit our choice to only one. We must never succumb to the temptation of restricting our fight for survival. We must oppose only socialism. We must oppose only free markets. We must oppose the preclusion of the choice, and we must oppose defeat. In the end, only humanity can save us. Only we will save ourselves.
Thank you very much, Philip, for that thought-provoking speech. Order, please. Order. Order. Thank you. We'll do a final round of floor speeches. Would anyone like to speak in proposition?
Hi, I'm Mia. I'm at Churchill College. I just thought I'd make a quick speech based on the idea that the ideologies of socialism has kind of been bashed as unimportant during this whole debate. But I think it is important because if we look at kind of socialism versus consumer capitalism, which is what we have in the US and what we're kind of filtering through to have in this country as well, socialism values society and it values humanity and it values the people within the society. Consumer capitalism and similar models of capitalism, they only care about profits. They only care about like the top 1%, the richest, getting richer. So if we look at what is causing the problems that have arisen during this debate, climate change, for one, COVID, another one. It is consumer capitalism which is creating these problems due to overconsumption, overproduction, and I'm saying it didn't cause the COVID pandemic, but it didn't help it either, did it? Because we didn't have the socialist values which helped the people who were dying in care homes or the people in the underfunded NHS system, which could have been improved massively if we had more socialist values in this country and other countries. Overall, I want to say is that if we abide by socialist values of caring for everyone in society, instead of caring about profits and caring about accountability and responsibility, there is no way that can harm us. It can only help us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Would anyone like to speak in opposition of the motion? At the back.
Grace Maudlin. Many years ago, this chamber was debating Christianity, and the philosopher A.J. had great difficulty because he was debating against the Archbishop of Canterbury, the leader of the Methodists, and some other Christians, and they all appeared to believe different things. We have the same problem tonight with socialism. We have heard several different ideas described as socialism, but I think I'm trying to take a common thread out of it, which all the people in favor of the motion would agree with. And that is they feel that the solution lies in having governments that regulate markets, governments that impose things. The problem with that is you've got to elect them. And actually, it's not about governments. What's going to solve it, and the only thing, is changing minds. It's only when we can change the minds of people, whether they regard themselves as socialists or liberals or conservatives or anything else, it's only by changing minds that we'll solve the problem.
Thank you. And would anyone like to speak in abstention?
To draw on a point that I think was made earlier and not really addressed, which is I think the economic system we're talking about is a distraction here. I think a point was made earlier up here that what we're really talking about with stopping climate change is a massive lockdown that's going to be hugely authoritarian. We have to stop people eating meat. We have to stop people going to Spain on holiday. These are things that people clearly don't want to do, and they have to stop doing them in the short term. So what we need is not the economic system that regulates markets more or least. We need the economic and political system that controls people's personal choices. We need to think if we're ready to relinquish democracy in order to save the planet, and I think that's something the speakers need to address tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Order, please. Thank you. Moving on to our final proposition speaker. Order. Order. Thank you. Our final proposition speaker is Dr. Maya Rose Craig. Dr. Maya is a British Bangladeshi ornithologist, environmental youth activist, and campaigner for equal rights. Maya is the founder of the non-profit organization Black to Nature, working to make the conversation and environmental sectors ethnically diverse. Maya, you have the ears of the House.
Yeah. Thank you. I think one of the really interesting things about climate change is that we're not lacking solutions, we're not lacking technology, we know how to solve climate change. And as someone whose 20th birthday is this weekend, one of the things that makes me angriest is this is an issue that could have been solved before I was even born. And so I think the fact that we're not lacking this technology, you know, online I see these feel-good stories popping up all the time about, you know, the brand new carbon removal technology or the new enzymes we've discovered that can eat plastic and, you know, all that sort of thing. And yet, despite all of this, we're not actually doing anything about climate change. We're not taking these bold, decisive steps that are needed to actually do anything about it. We're hearing our governments make these promises all the time, but nothing in the scheme of things is being done. And I think the other thing about climate change is, yes, theoretically you can solve it via capitalism. There are ways that we can go about solving it now. But because of the way that capitalism is designed, it is based on a system of exploitation and consumption. It means that even if we do manage to solve climate change through this economic system, there'll be another issue afterwards, and there'll be another one because we are destroying this planet. I think the true schism between the right thing to do and what is most profitable can be seen in a simpler case study as fossil fuel companies. We've already heard tonight about the massive lobbying power that these corporations have and the way that that has been so destructive on the planet, in particular with American policy. And I think one of the really interesting things, I was lucky enough to be able to go to the UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow last November, something that should have been a momentous moment in terms of UK climate change policy. And one of the really telling things was the fact that there were more representatives from fossil fuel companies than from any single national delegation. And I think that shows the hand that they have in climate change conversations. These companies are working furiously in the background to make sure their businesses stay profitable regardless of their environmental impact. These organizations were some of the first to know about climate change back in the 70s, and their response wasn't to share this information, but to suppress it, and succeeded at doing so for over a decade, regardless of the fact that they knew that this would eventually kill millions of people and make billions suffer. Instead of doing anything to change their business model, which under capitalism is the logical thing to do, they instead worked hard for decades to make sure that they could continue to sell their fossil fuels and their oil. It seems telling that these companies, while spreading their climate misinformation, were using the same companies that tobacco companies employed to make sure that people didn't learn about the negative effects of smoking. These companies could have been some of the first to take those steps towards renewables or other more environmentally friendly things. They could have forged their way forward, and they chose not to in exchange for a quick buck. In the meanwhile, like I said, they launched this campaign of climate misinformation. They were fighting back furiously against any attempt to make from our governments to become more environmentally friendly. Despite knowing climate change was very real, they led campaigns of confusion and misinformation that were all about making the public question the validity of climate science. Just one company, Exxon, spent over $30 million on think tanks that would promote climate denial. It's only in recent years that these companies have caught up with the fact that climate change is in fact real and is in fact going to affect their businesses and therefore their profits. And they've launched on frantic campaigns of greenwashing. Shell, for example, has launched a massive campaign advertising their carbon offsetting program while simultaneously spending billions in bribes to make sure they can continue to extract oil. In my opinion, one of the most fascinating things about these campaigns of misinformation surrounding the climate crisis is how it's leaned into this culture of individualism that capitalism absolutely encourages. Historically, humans have always been community-based species. We're social and we work best in groups. But one of the most interesting side effects of capitalism is this increased focus on the individual, especially in terms of seeing ourselves as consumers rather than citizens. We don't see ourselves as part of a collective, but instead, we measure ourselves by who can work the hardest, the longest, and the fastest to succeed economically. Fossil fuel companies have managed to take advantage of this, and that can be seen in the invention of the concept of the carbon footprint. In the early 2000s, fossil fuel companies wanted to shift the blame and attention away from themselves when it came to climate change. And so a think tank funded by BP, who currently produce 3.7 million barrels of oil per day, came up with the genius idea of blaming climate change on individuals. In 2004, they unveiled their new invention, a carbon footprint calculator, so that everyday people could figure out just how much of a negative impact they were having on the planet. This shifted the way that we think about our relationship with the environment and with pollution. And now many people don't think of the solution to climate change as being something that needs to be systemic or institutional, but rather something that is based in individual choices, which is absolutely untrue in a world where over 70% of carbon emissions come from only 100 companies and corporations. This is something that can't be solved without government intervention, and at the moment, our governments and our leaders are seemingly refusing to put the regulations in place to force these organizations to accountability. Individual choices do, of course, matter to an extent. If you decide to drive to work rather than cycle, if you decide to cut meat from your diet, it does make a difference. But I think not in the way that we think. These individual actions don't make a difference as individuals. It's only when we join together as a collective in the thousands or the millions that it does actually have an impact, and still that is less than what would happen if there was this systemic or institutional change. To bring this conversation back to the original proposition, to bring it back to socialism, I think it's this idea of moving away from seeing ourselves as individuals within the wider economic system and instead seeing ourselves as part of a wider community that is going to be essential in terms of fighting climate change. Furthermore, the politics around climate change are becoming increasingly radical. I think it's really interesting because 30 years ago, the way that politicians approached climate change would have been that conservative parties dealt with climate change in a conservative way, and liberal parties would have dealt with climate change in a liberal way. But we're seeing this increasing shift, especially in the right, where they're leaning towards far-right populism in many countries, and that goes hand in hand with anti-academia, anti-intellectualism, and climate denial. And therefore, it's gone from conservatives dealing with climate change in economically forward ways and liberals dealing with things in liberal, progressive ways. And instead, it's become an issue where the right, in theory, doesn't care about the environment that much, and it's seen as a left-wing issue. And I think it's that. I think it boils down to that, which means that any option of dealing with climate change in a more economically viable way is slowly being wiped away politically. And so, yeah, go for it.
A fair amount of far-right parties have actually talked about more localized economies and focused on nationalism. And to me, that actually is a possible solution for climate change. So, yeah, what do you think about that?
Yeah, that's fair. I think, obviously, to an extent, climate change can be dealt with within borders and things like that, but at the end of the day, it is an international issue. And I think, although obviously you can enter into conversations around the exploitation that's come from globalization and imperialism, I think at the end of the day, this does have to be an international project. And so I think the fact that a lot of these governments are stepping away from that international relations is very telling. And I think at the end of the day, this means that regardless of whether or not you think that you can deal with climate change in a more right-wing way, that option is slowly being taken away from us. So to conclude, I think capitalism is exploitative, and it's based on consumption, and it means that both the environment and the poorest people in the world suffer. There are so many bad companies, immoral companies that have so much influence, and that is the reason, essentially, that we haven't been able to solve climate change already, because we can. And I think when we want people to be angry about climate change, I want people to remember that this is an issue that could have been solved a very long time ago. And so I just want to end this with the sentiment that this is a major issue. It's a world-ending issue. It's a humanity-ending issue, and that radical issues need radical solutions. And in my opinion, that is socialism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maya. Moving on to our final speaker of the evening, Sir Vince Cable. Sir Vince is a former leader of the Liberal Democrats and a former president of the Cambridge Union. As Secretary of State for Business, Innovation and Skills, he oversaw the launch of the first Green Investment Bank. He has also authored multiple books on the financial crisis, emergent economic challenges, and future solutions. Sir Vince, the floor is yours.
President, thank you very much for inviting me back to the Union. We've had three really excellent speeches about climate change. Rightly, this is an existential issue. I agree with almost everything that was said. But I think in many ways, Sir David set the tone. He made one of his customarily very powerful, persuasive contribution. But I think, devoted about 20 seconds of his 10-minute speech to the issue of how you create a system to deal with it. And if I'm correct, I don't think he actually mentioned the word socialism once. Maya did, and I want to address some of the issues she's raised. And I want to do that by indulging, if I can, in a bit of nostalgia, because 60 years ago, almost to the day, I made my maiden speech here on a motion which is very similar to the motion you have now. And the reason it was being debated was that we had a communist president who believed in world socialism. It was very much the spirit of the time. The Cuban Revolution had just happened. We had the great helmsman in China who was going to make the big leap under socialism from backwardness to modernity in China through a great leap. And there was enormous enthusiasm in the student body and amongst academics for this spirit. And we only discovered years later that what had happened under this socialist transformation was actually one of the greatest famines in human history. About 30 million people died. Now, you might think, well, why am I going back to these messianic maniacs of the past? Well, of course, they're still around. I mean, I don't know how many of you read the thoughts of Kim Jong-un in your spare time, but I picked up a little gem this week of his thoughts on socialism. He said, we must root out the evil spirits of unsocialism and non-socialism, which are infecting the minds of the people. And I guess we are, on this side anyway, the evil spirits of this debate. But of course, we're not North Korea. Britain is a gentle democratic country. And whenever we've had socialism in Britain, it's been democratic socialism through the Labour Party. But it's worth reflecting again a little bit on the experience of that and its potential for achieving transformational change, which is what this debate's about. When I spoke in this debate here 60 years ago, we'd had at that time about 10 years of Tory government. It was tired, scandal-prone. Some of you may notice similarity. And the new leader of the Labour Party was a man called Harold Wilson, who was going to transform Britain through the white-hot heat of the technological revolution. Well, he did form a government. It wasn't actually a bad government. It wasn't a good one either. It did very little. And like the two successive periods of Labour government, it sort of lurched from crisis to crisis, and transformation there never was. And you might say, well, this is just Britain. But actually, if you look around to wider experience, there are much more positive stories to tell, because there are some countries, and you can measure their performance by looking at things like the Human Development Index or Better Welfare Index, and the United Nations publish these things. And the countries that always come out on top, it's the same group, the 5 Scandinavians, New Zealand, Canada, maybe I should add Costa Rica after this evening. And they have things in common. They're not governed by an ism. They're basically social democratic, social liberal, sometimes Christian Democrat. They're based on consensus. They have, on the one hand, a high level of social awareness, environmental awareness, but at the same time, they have a market economy, they practice capitalism, they make best use of business expertise. That's the nature of these mixed economies, and it's one we don't have. The model that we have been offered, and you've experienced it here, is the vision of democratic socialism that was offered a few years ago by Jeremy Corbyn. Now, unlike many people in British politics, I actually rated Jeremy Corbyn, I rather liked the guy. And we voted together very often in defense of civil liberties against the Iraq War. But we had a problem. The big issue in British politics in the last decade, certainly the last 5 or 6 years, hasn't been climate change. Maybe it should have been, but it hasn't been. It was Brexit. And the problem was that the leader of British democratic socialism didn't know whether he was in favor of Brexit or against it. And at the end of the period, we still didn't know. And as a result, you have got a world which is dominated by Brexit. The Conservatives knew what they wanted, he didn't, and you've got it. And you're going to have to live with the consequences. And that, I'm afraid, is at the record of democratic socialism applied in Britain. But to revert to the narrower but crucial issue of global warming, it's worth looking at those countries which have actually achieved progress in cutting carbon emissions relative to the growth of their economy. And there's a statistical record. You can see who's doing well and who's doing badly. On top of the list is Denmark since the turn of the century, followed by Sweden. And it's that same group of social democratic, social liberal countries using a combination of intelligent government and market forces that actually produces results. There is an anomaly, and it's an interesting one and a rather troubling one, that if you go back to 1980 as your baseline and you find out which are the countries that have done best in cutting carbon emissions, the country that comes out very near the top is Britain. And there's a very particular reason for that. That in the 80s, as we heard earlier, the Prime Minister was Margaret Thatcher. Very right-wing, very conservative. And Mrs. Thatcher, amongst many contributions, destroyed the coal mining industry as a matter of policy. Vindictive, brutal, alienated large numbers of working-class communities in Britain, but destroyed the coal mining industry, destroyed the main base of carbon production in British industry. The British left, the socialist left, opposed it, based its policies for many years on we must defend coal mining. But Margaret Thatcher didn't. She did something else which has largely been forgotten. And I say this as somebody who was a political adversary of Margaret Thatcher and her party. She was the first politician, really, of any party in any country who actually got the science of climate change and advocated reaction in terms that Sir David would probably have been proud of. And she crafted a component of dealing with climate change through the so-called Montreal Protocol that dealt with CFC as one of the contributors to global warming. And it is the framework, the template for the kind of multilateral cooperation between countries that you need in order to combat climate change. And it has worked. It's limited. It doesn't deal with carbon and methane and so on, but it's as far as it went, it was a pioneering effort to develop combating and damaging environmental change. And the lesson I think we learn from that is that if we're really going to fight climate change, we need political consensus. Right-wing people, left-wing people, government, private enterprise. And in my last minute, I'd just like to illustrate this with reference to something I'm doing. I've retired from politics. I now sit on the board of a startup company promoted by some young guys who want to be rich. And they want to be rich, and they also want to save the planet. And what we're doing is bringing hydrogen from electrolyzers, which are charged by electricity, green electricity, from wind farms in the North Sea, which exist, I should add, because of the market reforms brought in by Liberal Democrat ministers in the coalition and financed by the Green Investment Bank that I started. And we're using green electricity, generating hydrogen, shipping it to heavy goods vehicles, replacing diesel. And we're generating a lot of revenue, improved shareholder value, and we're cutting a lot of carbon emissions. Now, okay, we're a small company doing a modest amount. It may succeed, it may fail. But what I do know is that there are hundreds of entrepreneurs around the country doing variations of that idea. How do we improve the planet by getting rich? And not just in Britain, it's happening in Germany, in Scandinavia, in California. It's happening in China. You know, state capitalism in China is a very innovative system. Larger numbers of Chinese are becoming billionaires with the support of the Communist Party, introducing major technological innovations in the field of low carbon. And this is how it will be done, a combination of good government and business, markets and social awareness. The two things have to go together. Talking about this coming through socialism is never going to happen, and it's never worked. Thank you.
So Vince, thank you so much, and thank you all for another great debate. In this house, we vote with our feet. Please use the aye door, the no door, the abstain door, and the result will be announced in the bar afterwards. Thank you.